All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. In our All Things England edition, our All Things Great Britain edition, we are rejoined by Pat Byrne, who is Irish, who is Irish British, but he is based in Brazil. He's been a long-time union activist, education activist, workers' rights activist, and a long-time Marxist, and dare I say, a left-wing intellectual, and he's back on the program to discuss to do an election autopsy and where does the left go from here now that Labour is back in the seat of power. So first off, Pat, thank you for coming back on the program.
Nice to see you, Youri.
Likewise.
Good to be back.
Likewise, Pat. And I guess my first question, which is which is a general question, is what did you make of the UK elections? What did you make of Labour's victory? And why do you think Labour managed to have its political comeback?
Well, I found this was the strangest election result that I've certainly seen in my lifetime, because on the one hand you had the lowest turnout for many decades, something like only about just over 52% voted, whereas Britain, typically turnouts in Britain tend to be around 70+%. And when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party in 2017, for example, we had a much higher turnout. So that was the first one. That was the first thing. And the reason for the low turnout was two things, I think. Was one, that people felt for a long time that it was a foregone conclusion that Labour was going to win the election by a big majority in the Parliament. And, that tends to make it less exciting, doesn't it? So that's one thing. But a deeper reason as well, I think, was because they didn't feel that that Labour was offering anything in particular that would make their lives better, or if they were going to do some things, it might be on the margins. And Labour wasn't promising much in their manifesto. It was a very thin manifesto, and in fact, they were promising the least of the main parties. So of course that didn't create any, generate any enthusiasm. So, and when they did interviews with Vox Pop interviews in the street, mainstream media, television channels were doing them, and Guardian was doing them, etc. The typical answer that we're getting from a lot of people is they're all the same. I'm not going to vote. There's not much in it for me, etc., etc. So, so that was the first thing I thought was very strange. The second thing was that
very sad,
Labour.
actually.
Yeah, well, the thing is that once Jeremy Corbyn was no longer leader of the Labour Party and Starmer took over, it meant that the Labour Party moved into the centre, and it's even difficult to describe them as centre left now. I can just about describe them as centre left.
I think sorry to interrupt, but I would say I would say that the Labour Party is a center-right party. If there is such a concept as one nation conservatism, compassionate conservatism, or a liberal party, a major liberal party, oh yeah, that's Labour. And even when Labour was founded to be a democratic socialist party, so even when Labour on paper was supposed to be a socialist party, it always was, I would say, a rival oligarchic party, very much a Zionist party, pro-nuclear weapons party, and often very much a classist party in which they had a very top-down approach to democracy and would often kneecap their own grassroots supporters, which are people of a working class background, whereas the Liberal Party that used to exist was very much, middle class background, but would try to appeal to the working class because they had no other options because of the nature of the Conservative Party.
Sure. Well, I'm kind of looking at Labour in a bit more broader way than that, because there's other things you have to take into account when assessing the nature of the party. First of all, the fact that it came out of the trade union movement, was founded by the trade unions, as an alternative, in 1900, as an alternative to the existing Conservative and Liberal parties, who are like the equivalent of the American Republican Democratic parties. And it was set up, quite early on. It adopted a socialist constitution, and said, clause 4 in the constitution, which declared that it wanted to create a socialist society. And that, not only that, even up to the present day, most of the trade unions in Britain are affiliated to Labour. And that is that has always potentially been an important force, as we've seen at certain times of the Labour Party's history. And even now, Starmer has to declare himself. He actually calls himself, when he's challenged about this, he calls himself a socialist, which he's not, of course. But within the party, even in the Parliament, you have got a sizable socialist group, and even more so among the membership. So I'm kind of looking at it in a very broad way like that. And you're dead right when you say that every time they've got in power, or not every time, I mean, there was the 1945 Labour government was more radical. But with that exception, which was a very unusual period in the post-war, the devastation after the Second World War. But apart from that, every time Labour's got into government, they've tended to abandon their promises, and on crucial questions rule in the favour of the elite and the establishment and so on of Britain. So so I think that it's a complicated question and how to assess this party, but there's no question that when Jeremy Corbyn took over, and remember, this is recent history. The right wing within Labour, they tried to overthrow Jeremy Corbyn in 2016, and one of their strange tactics was for all of their members of the shadow cabinet to resign, and they hoped that would force Corbyn to resign himself, but it didn't. So we ended up where Corbyn had no choice but to appoint a left-wing shadow cabinet. So we had a very strange situation where the opposition shadow cabinet members, who are like the opposite numbers to the party in government, we had a shadow cabinet. We had a left-wing Minister of Finance, shadow Minister of Finance. We call the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We had a shadow left-wing shadow Home Secretary, even a shadow Defence Minister. and it was always historically the situation that the right wing of the Labour Party had wanted to hold on to these key posts of leader, finance minister, home secretary, interior minister, defence minister, and so on. They were the key posts that they'd always held on to, and now they were actually held by left wingers. So that was in very recent memory. We had a left wing socialist cabinet, shadow cabinet. So that's a very strange situation. But that frightened the right wing of the Labour Party, and not just them, but it frightened the whole establishment of Britain, because Corbyn came very close to winning that election, 2017. They calculate that there's only about 40,000 votes when spread over the marginal constituencies in it. And if Corbyn had been elected, I think that would have, I'm not saying that Corbyn himself as an individual would have, radically transformed the country, but it certainly would have led to a huge rise in expectations and could have sparked off a massive movement. And so they got frightened of that, the establishment of Britain, the ruling class. They became very frightened by this development, and they determined that they would never allow this to happen again. And that's why, Starmer, they obviously planned Starmer's election campaign for leader of the Labour Party, and that's why he's taken such a hard line against the left and moved the party even more to the right than it was under Blair. So you can see there that what's been happening, and Blair himself was a reaction to a left-wing movement in the 1970s and early 1980s. So you see this pendulum swinging.
In fact, Tony Blair, I mean, the Labour Party often describes themselves as a broad church, and if that is the case, there's a faction of that church which are economically liberal, neoliberal, monetarism,
Sure.
and, and stuff like that, and very neo-Keynesian when it comes to law and order, when it comes to the whole like welfare to work thing, very much inspired by Bill Clinton, who often talked vaguely a lot about the middle class, and people in the US confuse working class for middle class, because when the working class gains a lot of benefits and saw their living standards improve, and with social mobility, many of those working class people very quickly became the bourgeoisie, became middle class. So it's a very funny term, but as John Rees once said about Tony Blair, he's a middle class prat and so forth. So they look after a faction of their rival oligarchs, and the conservatives they look after very much big business,
Sure.
very draconian law and order, and so forth like that. So yeah.
But it's a good point you're making about the neoliberals.
I believe it was under Tony Blair or Neil Kinnock before him. They got rid of Clause 4, so now Labour is
under Tony Blair. Under Tony Blair, he led a big campaign to get rid of Clause 4, and I was on the National Defend Clause 4 campaign committee. So I was heavily involved in the campaign against that, and in fact it was funny, we had the big majority of the party with us. But then they used the new technology that had come in the middle 1990s to appeal over the head of the activists and the branches to the ordinary members, to get them to vote to accept this new clause. And many people did, because they didn't want to. They thought if we voted it down, then our new popular leader Tony Blair it would be very bad for the Labour Party's chances of winning the next election. So it was. But we actually had a lot of support for the old socialist clause in the party, but we lost that battle. But this guy, Starmer, Keir Starmer, he's gone even further, and of course, he's come to power in a very different situation, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The last point I wanted to make about the actual election result was, in terms of overall, was that Labour, because of the strange electoral system in Britain, Labour ran a very strange election campaign, which worked out, that it took advantage of the system where we call first past the post, which is like a horse race where you could have 10 horses crossing the line, and the horse has got the front of its nose just a bit ahead of everyone else, wins. So it's a very strange system.
Actually,
so we ended up
thanks for explaining that, because a lot of people get very confused when when people try to explain to them the first past the post system. It also exists in Canada, to a degree in Australia, not in New Zealand,
and in America. It's the same system as America.
Yeah,
it's the reason you end up with basically almost just two parties dominating the system. Because you end up at that, and it's unlike proportional representation, where you allocate the number of seats in the parliament according to percentage of the vote you get nationally and locally in the country. It's not done like that. So if you had, for example, you could have a crazy situation where in a local constituency you have 10 candidates, and the candidate who gets 11% gets elected, where all the others who all got 10% or 9% or whatever. The one who just got a tiny bit ahead gets elected. So we had a very strange situation. The result of this election is that Labour, they only got about 1/3 of the vote, 34% of the vote, but they got 2/3 of the parliament, which is a very strange result. And you also had the Liberals, for example. They got a fairly low vote, but they got like over 70 members of the parliament, whereas other parties who were distributed, the way the system works is that if you have your support very concentrated in an area of the country, you do much better than if you have it scattered evenly across the country. So other parties like the Green Party, who got, like 4 million votes, along with the Reform Party, they only got like a few members of parliament, like 4 members of parliament the Green Party got.
So 4 members of parliament, and even themselves, they said that due to this undemocratic system, our expectations are very low, but we are hoping to get our 4 seats. And you know what? And we'll talk about that in a bit. But I would,
sure.
I would have to say, congratulations to the Greens. And although this is a very unpopular opinion, I'm actually quite happy that the Liberal Democrats got their 71 seats and had a bit of a political comeback, because I was more impressed with the Liberal Democrats' manifesto, heavily emphasizing on social care, rebuilding the NHS, spending millions on the NHS, and although they didn't explicitly advocate merging mental health care into an NHS system, they vowed that they would open up a lot of mental health facilities and dental care facilities as part of a NHS. But that's an NHS that still needs to be renationalized into a proper single payer system, and not the quasi-privatized system it is. So actually, that's a perfect question then to this.
So, well, before we go on to these other parties, just one last point, just to explain to the viewers about the strange nature of this election. Labour followed a very unusual and cynical and undemocratic electoral strategy. What they did was they didn't bother to campaign in the Labour areas, their traditional Labour areas that they had already got MPs for. They just took all their whatever resources they had, and they focused on campaigning in the Conservative marginals, especially in the Midlands, North, and so on. And that way, what it meant was that they weren't interested in turning out their own supporters, which is a bit, as I say, a very undemocratic and cynical attitude, but you don't really care about your own people. You're just so focused on winning taking advantage of the electoral system and winning over these Conservative marginal seats. And then that's what they did. So that's just so that people can understand the general, how the general strategy went, and what a strange result it resulted in. But having said that, of course, everybody's very happy that the Conservatives lost the election. That was the mood of the electorate, that they, after 14 years of Conservative rule, in which they'd gone, they'd implemented all these terrible austerity measures, which had cut back the public services. It led to a massive fall in living standards and so many other problems. Homelessness, and so on. Yeah.
And they also de facto privatized. The NHS was going through free market reforms and stuff like that, beginning with Thatcher, exacerbated by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. But under the Conservative Liberal coalition government, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, they did de facto privatized the NHS. And it's a scandal that the British corporate media and newspapers and radio shows do not shout this at the top of their lungs, given how it's the one thing where if you're a Tory, everybody loves the NHS. So it's important to
Well, I mean, yes, there's definitely been this creeping privatization in the NHS, but I wouldn't take it too far. The bulk of the NHS is still public, and overwhelmingly so. But Labour has got a plan to introduce more privatization into the NHS. But the biggest problem with the NHS, in terms of that caused a crisis in its services, was the fact that the Cameron Clegg coalition government in 2010, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, launched this massive cost-cutting operation. In fact, one of the few good things under Labour, under Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown, was that they did greatly increase the funding for the NHS. And so by the time that they lost the election following the big banking crisis, 2008, the election that followed in 2010, they did, the last survey that I'd seen of people, ordinary people, was that there was an 88% approval rating of the NHS and its services, which is pretty good. But now, of course, it's way down in the like 30s or something like that. And so they cut the money for the NHS drastically, and that, as a result of that, the NHS got into a terrible crisis even before the pandemic. And of course, when the pandemic hit it, which they didn't prepare for, which they were supposed to do, but they didn't, the result of that made it even worse. And so now we've got 8 million people waiting for operations, for example. And as a result of that, we've got huge numbers of people who are now on disablement benefit, can't work, waiting for operations, which is a crazy short-sighted way to approach the economy. Never mind health.
And many of them actually faced, when people, we should actually explain this to people. When people talk about cutting welfare and going after benefits, cheats, and stuff like that, you may feel good that you're doing that, but bear in mind, when you do that, you are not only hurting the most vulnerable people who do not want to ask the government for handouts, but they're so desperate that this is the only game in town. So when people talk about cuts to welfare, cuts to unemployment checks, and cuts to benefits for people with very needy children and stuff like that, that affects disabled people the most, disabled people who want to work and so forth. And there's I'm blanking on the book's name, but there was a very good book about how the reign of terror that was the David Cameron, Nick Clegg austerity, how badly it impacted people who were disabled. And shout out to Steve Tupple of the Canary, who also covered it a lot for the Canary when they first started under Kerry Washington. But so that leads. So that of course that wasn't the only result of the election, but that so the Conservatives ended up with only, after having something like 300, I don't know what the number they had was, 380 seats in the Parliament, they went down to 130 seats, which is an incredible fall. And Labour has now got something like 410 seats or something in the Parliament now, an overwhelming 410 out of 650 gives you an idea that all the opposition parties, even if they all voted together, would have no big impact on the vote on any legislation and so on, unless of course Labour itself was to have big divisions, which could happen as well. Yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue to this, which is, as I've said before many times on the program, I often underestimate the power of corporate state media. And you yourself, we've talked about this many times off the air, that the left has completely fell asleep on the wheel in terms of the power of public relations, propaganda machine that dominant capitalist parties use. So that being said, when Jeremy Corbyn only got the endorsement of Vice Media, the Daily Mirror, their only corporate media endorser, the Morning Star, Red Pepper. I believe those were Corbyn's only, endorsements, and all of the other newspapers, magazines overwhelmingly endorsed Boris Johnson or tactical voting because they felt that Corbyn wasn't strong enough on Brexit, which was ridiculous.
You're talking here about the 2019 general election, aren't you? Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So how much? So how much would you say the corporate media, particularly newspapers and magazines, had an impact on this election? Because Labour was endorsed by the following. Labour was endorsed by the Daily Mirror, the Guardian, the Independent, the Observer, Sunday Times, the Daily Star, Financial Times, New Statesman, The Economist, Evening Standard. So that's 10. City AM, Express and Star, and Liverpool Express. So they got about what? So that's about like 9 to 11 endorsements from big corporate dailies and so forth. Now the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party got their endorsements from the usual right-wing newspapers, far-right newspapers, I would even say. Daily Express, Sunday Express, Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, the Times, Daily Telegraph, and Sunday Telegraph. So, your response to that? Do you think that the media do you think that the media helped Labour's victory? Oh, and one last thing. The Sun decided to back Keir Starmer, Rupert Murdoch's major newspaper. Backed Keir Starmer. So once again, whatever Rupert Murdoch and the Sun wants, the British people get. So your response?
Yeah. I would. The first point I'd make about that is that what it does show is that the majority of the ruling elite in Britain wanted this result. They wanted Labour to win, and they wanted the Conservatives out of office. And you saw this reflected in the switch over of Conservative donors, billionaires and so on, over to Labour. So you could see there so this reflected that. But I would also point out that perhaps more importantly was the role of the television. You know, that the newspapers in Britain now have very poor circulation. In fact, they even had to pass a change that ceased actually giving the figures. You know, there used to be a thing where you had to give the circulation. Every newspaper had to publish its circulation every year, and that's been done away with because it's so embarrassing now. Even the Sun has got, you know, very poor circulation. So I suspect that they had very little influence on the election result, but the TV, of course, were obviously very clearly pro Labour in the way they covered things, you know.
Wait, interesting that you say that. I might challenge you a little bit on that, but so which television outlets, which ones did you think were very were, if not anti-Tory, certainly more for Labour because it was under this centre-right douchebag
leadership? Starmer. Well, it's just the way it's, you know, they're much more subtle, the TV channels, because they're not allowed to be quite so openly pro one party or another as the newspapers are allowed.
So that would be Sky, BBC,
that would be
Channel 4,
ITV, and so on. Yeah.
And LBC.
So they what they do is they and on top of that, when an election's called, special rules are introduced, which they have to give some publicity to other parties and alternatives. And that made a huge difference, for example, in the 2017 election, which I could go into how the television played a big role in that election and helped Jeremy Corbyn despite themselves. But you know, the way the television had operated over the last 2 years, it was quite clear that they favoured Labour and that they constantly were attacking the Conservatives, exposing all kinds of mess ups the Conservatives were getting into, divisions within the Conservative Party. So it's quite subtle the way they do it, but it was pretty obvious to anybody who watched it. And of course, people, when the election comes along, people take a greater interest in politics, and particularly to watch the television for the different debates and discussions and news and so on. So, you know, and of course, Labour had a pretty good story to tell in terms of their criticism of the Conservatives. The Conservatives have made such a mess of things and had gone through one prime minister after another, one leader after another, and had discredited themselves with their policies and the lies that they've been telling. And so, of course, and the prime minister Sunak had not he didn't help himself. from the beginning of the election campaign. I think we talked about this in the last meeting we had on here. You know, from the moment he announced the election campaign in the rain, with the music, with Labour's Tony Blair's election campaign song playing in the background from the street next door to the Downing Street, onwards, it just was one fatal mistake after another in terms of public relations. So, and of course, the media, whereas the media might have in other times played down these things or not even reported them, they played them up, and that's it, you know. And
I find it, well, I think it's interesting that you say it, because I think if you look at the ITV debate and the Sky debate, ghastly. By the way, folks, don't even torture yourselves.
No, don't bother. No.
But on Sky, but Sky News, I felt that they were very unfair to both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and I say this as somebody who doesn't like either of the two ungentlemen. Yeah. So they would attack Keir Starmer for endorsing Jeremy Corbyn, and then they would keep attacking Keir Starmer. Well, you're not trustworthy on this. You're not trustworthy on that. You're not very clear in whose taxes are going to go up. When Keir Starmer, I felt, was vaguely clear, and then with Rishi Sunak, it was you say you want tax cuts, but you've been raising people's taxes, and then when Sunak kept trying to explain to him, look, I inherited a mess because of the pandemic and because of you know, the war in Ukraine, which I think is a lame excuse. But every time Sunak, kept trying to explain to them, look, the economy has been going back on track, not as much as we would like it to be, but that's only because of COVID, hangovers. And I thought that the media I felt the broadcast media was, I think, very unfair on both Sunak and Starmer, and again, I say this as somebody who doesn't like either of them.
Well, you're talking about, all you're talking about there really is just the debate program formats that they have to, I mean, they have to, in those formats, present themselves as even-handed between both sides. Otherwise, it would, the people would all complain about it. So they have to put hostile questions to both leaders in that situation. And so I don't think that tells us very much, though, generally about that. But one thing that does point to was that the media did pick up on a problem that Keir Starmer has, and which reflects the whole political system nowadays, is that the public relations revolution has kind of eaten itself to the point where all the politicians have become inveterate liars, all the top politicians, and they can't help themselves. And Starmer is a classic example. He's constantly lying about things, and therefore he is not trustworthy. Nor was Sunak, the Prime Minister, who constantly lies about things. So therefore, and of course, Boris Johnson had resigned in disgrace because of his lies, and so the people have got to the point now where they don't believe anything the politicians say, and this was reflected. I talked about those vox pop in the street interviews, and a lot of people were saying that they didn't trust Starmer, and he's not popular. I mean, that's another strange thing about the election, is that normally when a party wins a big majority, a landslide majority in the parliament, their leader is popular, naturally. When Blair got elected, he was pretty popular in 1997. But Starmer is not popular. His approval ratings are highly negative, and not that much far away from something like -50 compared to -75 for Sunak. So this is a again, another unusual situation, which I think is going to have, these things are going to have a big impact on the future of the Labour government and how it turns out. But perhaps we could now go on to talk about the other election results in this election, because
yes. So it was quite an incredible election, because what's not being reported, and first off, you have the green victories of the four MPs who ran for their seats who got elected, and congratulations to the Greens. I think they're going to be a much needed voice when it comes to the climate crisis and attacking the Labour Party from the left and from a very modest eco-socialist perspective. There's problems with their foreign policy and that they believe in NATO, pivot to Asia, and so forth like that, and aren't they could be more brave when it comes to standing up for the Palestinians and speaking out against, British imperialism. But that aside, then you have the Liberal Democrats, and again, this is not a popular opinion, but I'm happy that the Liberal Democrats got their 71 seats because I was more impressed with their manifesto than Labour's. And I think they will also be attacking Labour from the left and attacking both Labour and the Conservatives as being two, right-wing twins. And it'll be very interesting to see if the left faction of the Liberal Democrats and the socially liberal faction of the Liberal Democrats will take on the baton of trying to de-escalate the drug war, protecting the rights of LGBTQIA+ people, and making education much more accessible to vulnerable people and whatnot. Then you had Reform, our favorite right-wing joker, the real-life Riddler, Nigel Farage. He finally won his seat in Clacton, and Reform got 4 seats.
Five seats altogether, yeah.
5 seats. So it'll be very interesting to see if their movement will grow and if they will unseat the Conservatives as the major right-wing force in Westminster. Nigel is trying to model that by looking at how the Reform Party did in Canada, but of course they later had to push out Preston Manning and later became the Canadian Alliance, and then they had some words with the Progressive Conservatives to become the Conservative Party. Anyway, boring Canadian history for our British audience. Now, but let's talk about this.
So perhaps before we move on from this, you've raised some good points there. Maybe we can get them deal with those 3 you talked about. So, for example, the Liberal Democrats, they did produce a better manifesto than Labour, which is not saying much actually. But they were pretty open about this, that they weren't expecting to become the government of Britain, so they felt that they had the luxury to be able to promise things that they wouldn't have to deliver, and so that was one aspect. And they didn't really, the only way to fund all the money they were promising for the NHS and other things would be to put up the taxes on the rich. The rich has got this huge inequality in Britain. The taxes on the rich have gone down dramatically over the last 50 years since Mrs. Thatcher's time. And so the logical place to gain the money from would be the rich, but they're not, the Liberals don't want to do that. And remember that the Liberals won almost every single seat they won was a Conservative seat. They won all their seats from the Conservative seats, which gives you an idea that they're really a kind of a safe haven for discontented Conservative voters, and they've always been that way. So that's the first problem with the Liberals. But you're right. I think in the Parliament we're going to see them voting, because there isn't really much other ground for them to go to. They've got, because you've got the Conservatives and the Reform Party occupying the right. You've got Labour occupying the centre, so they've only got the left to go into. So I suspect that they will vote with other opposition parties against government on particularly important right-wing policies and so on some of them anyway. So I think you're right about that.
But I think it's important to say, though, that Labour's victory isn't because people were so attracted to Keir Starmer and his message,
right?
But
they were anti-Tory,
But it was just a protest vote against the Conservatives.
Exactly.
So,
exactly, and they
because people got fed up with the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and you saw this reflected in the Liberal vote, was that basically people were looking tactically for what was the best party that had the best, the party that had the best chance in their area to defeat the Conservatives. So the Liberals was a good example of that. On the Green Party, well, no, perhaps talk about talk about the Green Party first.
Well, I'll just say, I'll just say that the Green Party, for me, that's a much more constructive protest vote because they are this eco-socialist party. So
yeah, although I have to say that
yes,
that people who vote Green don't necessarily know that. They will tend to see again. They would tend to see the Greens as a radical alternative to Labour, particularly on, and it also shows their concern about the environment and so on. But I don't think that they were very aware of the Green policies. And of course, the Greens were pursuing a less radical campaign in the seats in the Conservative areas. So there was a bit of opportunism going on there. But anyway, the fact that the Greens got 4 members of Parliament.
That's probably also factions of the Greens who believe in green capitalism and are modeling themselves on the German Greens and Greens across Europe, New Zealand, and Australia who have pivoted to the right on a lot of issues, unfortunately.
Well, the Greens in Britain so far have gone in a bit of a different direction, partly because the hundreds of thousands of Labour Party members who supported Jeremy Corbyn who have left the party, and some of those who've been expelled from the party on the left, some of them have joined the Greens, quite a fair number of them. And that has had and the Greens is not a large party in terms of membership, and that has had an impact in their conferences and so on. So, so that may have some effect now, that has now effect now and could have some effect in the future to make the Greens a bit more radical than their brother parties, sister parties in Europe, which have gone to the right quite decisively, especially like countries like Germany and so on,
Here's hoping that the Greens of the UK will be very much influenced by the Greens of the US, who are a radical eco-socialist anti-imperialist party. So
exactly, yeah.
But
then there was the Reform Party. Then there was the Reform Party, which is a very important, much more important development than, in my view, either the Liberals or the Greens. because of the electoral system, they got over 4 million votes, but they only got 5 members of Parliament. Normally, if it was a proportional representation, they'd have, I don't know what it would be, like 30 or 40 members of the Parliament. So it's not representative. Had a very successful general election, and I think we did in the last session about what happened with the Reform Party in the election. And what's very significant is that not only, as you said, their leader, who's probably the most charismatic and popular politician in Britain, generally speaking, everyone accepts that, Nigel Farage. But he also has this love affair with the television and the media, the right-wing media.
Yeah.
And so now he's in the Parliament. And the Conservatives basically are being discredited and will remain discredited for a long time to come. It'll take them a long time to overcome this terrible defeat and the record they've had in government before people will start to forget about that, or new generations grow up and so on. And so they, in a way, even though they only have 5 MPs, the fact that they've got this star leading them means that they will often be turned to by the media for when they want to hear an opposition voice to Starmer's government, Labour government. They'll often ask him to speak, and we've seen this already on the British television in the last few weeks. He's constantly on the television. I think this is going to continue, and so of course, as we know, if you've got a huge ongoing profile in the media, then that tends to mean that you're going to build and you're going to get stronger. And how that will work out vis-a-vis himself and his party, the Reform Party, which is his creation, and the Conservative Party and their relationship, we can't predict how that's going to work out. But I think, generally speaking, there's going to be a big trend towards the right, and a huge difference in society will be posed between Labour and the right. Now, that could lead to all kinds of problems. So, for example, they will organize these demonstrations outside immigrant hotels and all kind of stunts they will organize. And how successful they are is also dependent on how well the left does. As we've seen in France, contrary to what everybody expected, because the left were very well organized, and they had quite a popular program. They did very, very well in the elections, doing as a coalition, doing better than the right.
Yeah.
Now, big significant development in these elections in Britain, another one that we haven't yet talked about, is the fact that 5 independent radical candidates were elected, led by Jeremy Corbyn, and they stood as independents.
Yeah.
And this Britain, they got elected, and in fact, the independent candidates came close to getting elected in a number of other important Labour seats. So now, unfortunately, as we talked about in our last programme, the left was disunited. We had hoped that Jeremy Corbyn would, like about 6 months ago at least, or maybe even earlier, would have come off the fence and announced that he was going to stand as an independent and helped give his name to a broad coalition, united coalition on the left. And all the main groups on the left had said they would come behind him if he did that. But sadly, he didn't do that. He left it until the day after the election was announced. In other words, 6 weeks before the election date. And as a result, the left all went into separate ways. They all independent of each other mostly. And you had the most extreme examples were some constituencies where there were like 5 left candidates on the ballot. So the left had no chance in that situation. However, there was, towards the end of the election campaign, there was a bit of a coalescence in a thing called the collective, in which quite a lot of the left groups, in a way, many ways too late, and without a unifying manifesto, name, etc., they did join the collective with the idea that they would try to reduce the number of people standing against each other. And that did help. And of course, there was the question of Gaza, which has been a huge issue in Britain. So that helped quite a few of these independent candidates who were able to gather a lot of opposition, especially in the Muslim communities, but not exclusively, but among young people as well, and so on. So we ended up with these 5 people being elected.
Yeah, and I would say also broad British communities of different backgrounds, from South Asian backgrounds to
sure.
to Black communities, to Asian, so forth. And a lot of it because of the issue of Gaza and so forth, and the fact that that their idea of a protest vote, it was not to abstain or vote for the Reform Party, but was to vote for either Green, Liberal Democrats, or an independent right here. In fact, that's a perfect segue. While you were talking, I was trying to find the name of this politician called, because you mentioned how some ex-Corbyn people in the Labour Party who have either been kicked out or have resigned in disgrace have joined the Green Party, and one of them was actually Jo Bird, who's a councillor for a Wee role. Now, I don't think she won her election as a Green MP. But she was.
She did well, but she did very well. She did very well in the election from Liverpool. This is from Liverpool, yeah.
Now
from Merseyside.
Now, did she get second place or third place?
I don't know. I can't remember. I think it was second place, if I'm not mistaken. I think.
All righty. So. Now that is a perfect segue to this. So continuing on with what Pat was talking about, let's look at this. So. Ilford North, I was really hoping that this independent Anglo-Palestinian person, Leanne Mohamed, would win. Now, she didn't win in her election against Wes Streetling, who's Wes Streeting, who's Keir Starmer's right-hand man, but she got second place.
Not just second place, he came within 500 votes of winning. So it was a very, very close election. Now, funnily enough,
I was very inspired by her campaign. I loved her campaign, and I would have happily have been part of her campaign team and campaign for her, because she was brilliant.
If you think about it, if the left had Corbyn associated with it, the left alternative to Labour, and had come together in a united front with a popular radical manifesto name and so on, that would have certainly pushed some of these people over the line into winning. But not only that, but also on the Gaza issue, that the media was able to shut the Gaza issue out of the whole of general election campaign. It was never mentioned. But obviously, if the left had been united and been a serious force with big mass meetings around the country and so on, I don't think they'd have been able to do that. And of course, they'd have had to feature them on broadcasts and so on. So the fact that
we heard endless drivel and waste of oxygen about immigration, including attacking legal immigration, which I never thought we were going to get to that level. But that is the power of Nigel Farage and the right wing and the far right faction of the media, as well as new kids on the block like Spiked Online and GB News, who attack Rishi Sunak from the right, claiming he's not being right wing enough. And it's amusing to sometimes watch GB News where you have Nigel Farage, a former host, basically arguing with conservative with people who are pro conservative party, having them fight each other about who's the better right wing alternative to Keir Starmer, which is hilarious.
But I mean, despite all this, the fact that the left, I mean, I wrote a paper back in December in which I argued for the forces outside of Labour on the left to unite, form a united front, and take advantage of what was a unique moment in British politics where everybody knew that Labour was going to win by a big majority. So that gave some space for people to stand to be more radical than Labour. You didn't have that traditional force where workers would tend to vote Labour because they didn't want to let the Conservative in. They didn't have that centrifugal force. And so therefore you had an unusual situation. But despite, the fact that we didn't get this united front and we were very atomized, and therefore our voice was drastically reduced in the election. Nevertheless, the fact that we did get 5 members of parliament, and I'd said that was the minimum thing we had to achieve, it then gives a credible platform for the left outside of Labour to build in the future. And so and this is something maybe we can talk a bit more about, but the collective,
actually, we still got time, so let's get into it. So Milford North, Leanne Mohamed almost won second place against West Streeting, which I think we should look at with optimism. And then you have Derby South, Chris Williamson of the Workers' Party of Britain. He got 3rd place. 4th place was a Green MP. Then you had in Chingford and Woodford Green, although I'm not a big fan of Faiza Shaheen, she, the independent, got 3rd place. Which in fact, she got, it was almost all 3 candidates. It was a classic example of this first past the post system I talked about. All 3 main candidates all got almost the same vote. So the Conservative MP, who was a famous, he was the leader of the Conservative Party before, he got 13,000. And the Labour candidate got 12,800, something like that. And Faiza got 12,500. So they were all very, very close together. So it could have gone anyway. And if we on the left had been better organised with a more united campaign, we definitely could have won that seat. So there were quite a few other examples of this. Jess Phillips, for example, she only won by quite a small majority, and she's a prominent Labour figure.
to a left-wing candidate. So and there were a number of other places as well. So we could easily have got 10 or even a dozen candidates elected on a left ticket. You know,
there was another fine young woman, Fiona Lally, of the Revolutionary Communist Party, who was running in
Stratford and Bow.
Stratford and Bow is interesting. So a Green MP got second place. Workers' Party of Britain, Halima Khan, got third place. And there were several independents. Fiona Lally, sadly,
she got 1,500 votes. She got 1,500 votes,
so
which was not really that. I don't think that's significant.
But
I don't think that was.
Is that an example? Is that an example of too much lefties competing against one another?
Yeah, there were five. There were five social.
And I bet you, had they all gotten, had Workers' Party, Greens, and the other independents, assuming they're left-leaning, if they had all stepped aside and all endorsed Fiona Lally of the Revolutionary Communist Party, I think she would have gotten, if not first place, at least second place or third place.
Well, I have to say, Fiona, she comes across very well on the media, and she appeared on GB News, the right-wing TV channel you mentioned about, and she did get quite a bit of profile in the election, but she was never in a position to win that election. What should have happened, in my view, is that they should have all united behind Steve Headley, the leading trade unionist from the Trades Council in that area, who had been, all the left candidates shouldn't have been there. The left candidates.
Say his name again.
Steve Headley.
Oh yes, okay. He got last place.
But
375. Okay.
Yeah. The trouble was that you've got five left candidates all competing against each other. It's a mad situation. And my view is that you needed to go behind the candidate that had the longest, most importantly, strongest record in the community in that area, which was Steve Headley. So I think that they should have gone behind him. And he was the nominee of the Trade Union Council, the local Trade Union Council, and so on. But that's the trouble. When you don't have unity, a united front, you just have infighting. And it damages and atomizes the left. We can't afford that in the future. So one of the good things out of this election is that the collective, which I'd mentioned about before. There was another example of an election we shouldn't forget, is what happened in Starmer's own constituency in Holborn and St Pancras.
Andrew Feinstein got second place.
Yeah, so this is another weird example of this election. Normally, when Labour wins a big majority, or any party, its leader gets a fantastic vote in that area, doesn't it? But his majority actually went down from the last election, and the left alternative candidate Feinstein from this collective, he got something like 9,000 votes, a very high second place. And so you can see that this is not really a very pro-Labour or pro-Starmer vote. This vote, it was about trying to get rid of the Conservatives, and there was a lot of discontent. And so he's another example, including a number of others around the country who could have got. I don't know if he could have won that election, but he certainly did fantastically well, and it shows the feeling that existed.
And one moment. What can you tell us about the former health secretary, shadow health secretary under Jeremy Corbyn, John Ashworth, who's also a right-hand man of Keir Starmer? Now, he lost his seat against a Shaukat Adam, an independent. Is there anything you can tell us about Shaukat Adam? And was this one of the indie left Palestine justice protest votes?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and what was good about that election was they actually had
and this is for Leicester South.
Leicester South. Yeah, we pronounce a bit different. Strange English pronunciation. The strange English election, isn't it? Pronunciation. Well, funny enough, he like the candidate in Ilford North, who nearly defeated Wes Streeting, the leading Labour guy. In both cases, the local community had a kind of set up organization, and they interviewed candidates and they selected a candidate. And the fact that in both cases they did so well shows that's what should have happened in this constituency we were talking about with Stratford and Bow. So you see where if you've got a democratic procedure where the community groups come together and political groups locally in the area, and they interview the candidates and then they vote on who they want to be, and you get a consensus, you're going to have a much stronger base, aren't you? And this has got to be a model for the future that we can build on, because it showed it works, you know. And he did that as well. He was their locally chosen candidate. So he didn't just set himself up as a self-appointed person, you know.
Your response to the Rochdale results, Paul
Right.
Watts of the Labour Party unfortunately won. George Galloway lost his re-election. George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, lost his re-election. His vote went down, down, down. Well, 11,587 to Paul Watts, 13,027. Now, why do you think George Galloway, popular far left radio broadcaster, documentarian, longtime MP of several places, including the most impoverished but diverse parts of London, why do you think Galloway was unable to get re-elected, out of curiosity?
Well, on a parliamentary level, first of all, basically his vote didn't go down much at all. It was, I think he got 12,000 in the by-election, and it was 11,000 or something in the general election. What happened was that the guy who came second in the by-election, this independent guy, local businessman, who got quite a large vote in the Rochdale by-election earlier in the year, almost all of his votes went to Labour. And he didn't stand again, that guy, and they almost all went to Labour. But I think where George Galloway made mistakes in the election was that he came across far too much only as a single issue candidate on the Gaza issue, but also he decided to adopt a very strange electoral strategy. And you can see this reflected on his YouTube show. And
let's not beat around the bush.
All right.
Galloway played footsie with the far right and has been going down a bizarre far right reactionary rabbit hole since Brexit became the ghastly, never-ending soap opera that it became when Britain voted to leave the European Union. And he supported that and part of the Lexit campaign. And he identifies strongly with the far-right, corporatist, nationalist, traditional Labour voters known as Blue Labour, with the Fighters Union, Paul Emberby, and so forth. And they engage a lot in transphobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric and so forth.
Well, I would perhaps not go quite as far as that, in the sense that I think he was, because he has a very strong left side to his platform. And if you look at the work
on anti-imperialism, workers' rights, and so forth,
living standards and all those things, which is important. And his party, the Workers' Party, if you look at their platform, it doesn't include these right-wing things. It's a pretty good platform, its manifesto and so on. But he's playing a strange game, and I don't quite understand the logic of what he was trying to do. He was trying to appeal, as you were saying, to the right wing and the left at the same time. And I think that by trying to do that, he didn't appeal to either side, because on the one side, trying to appeal to the right would never work, because while the right wing might agree with him on some of his criticisms of the establishment, on Brexit and so on, and his kind of semi-approval of Trump, he says he doesn't approve of Trump, but he kind of, the implication of the way he talks about American politics and so on, it does come across that way. But that would appeal to the right. But then all his positions on the workers' questions and the international questions would alienate the right. So that wouldn't work. And then by doing so, and of course, he also tried to appeal to the right with all the anti-woke propaganda, about identity politics and so on.
Yeah,
on the other hand,
he said very queer-phobic things, and also was attacking the SNP. Now Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, that's a whole other topic altogether.
Yeah, of course.
But he attacks he's against Scottish independence, even though it's largely a center-left to far-left project, and he attacks the SNP from the right, which I find deplorable. But yeah.
But anyway, he didn't have any. In terms of Scotland, the SNP imploded quite a lot in these elections. They drastically lost their members, half their members of parliament, and their vote went down a lot. And the impetus for independence in Scotland at the moment is not strong, although that could revive again under the Labour government if people become discontented with that government. But anyway, so there wasn't, and Labour was putting the same position as him, so there wasn't any room for him to do anything in Scotland. But one of the things that he came out with, which wasn't the position of the Workers' Party that he's supposed to be the leader of and representing, but he came out with a very kind of like his own personal prejudices. So he was talking about a Catholic religion, which he's a strong advocate about. Well, that's a strange tactic, because the big majority of British people are either they're either Church of England or not religious, not Catholic, or they're Muslim or whatever they might be. So what the heck the point of that was? And so of course he also came out with anti-abortion talking points and about gays and all sorts of things, and he expressed them in quite unsophisticated reactionary terms. So that just put off the left. So so the thing was, and the other strange thing was that in the course of this electoral strategy of trying to appeal to the right on some things and the left on others, the big thing that he didn't emphasize about was the class questions on living standards, the cuts in public services, and all these other things, which is what I thought he was going to do, which is the big vacuum that existed in the election, and that Labour's abandoned those questions to go to the centre, and there wasn't anybody. I mean, the Greens did to some extent, but there wasn't an organised force like you thought the Workers' Party might have been after the big impetus they got in the by-election in Rochdale earlier in the year. They had a great chance to push that position and get a lot of votes. So I think that there were probably a lot of people in Rochdale who could have voted for him on the class issues, who probably didn't see any reason to, and they thought he stood mainly on the Gaza question, maybe, and some other bits and pieces. So I think he could have won that election. Still could have won that election, but
my advice to George Galloway and whoever are his advisors and his and his wife, who I believe sometimes co-hosts a program with him or used to on RT. My advice to George Galloway is, next time, stay in your lane. Stay in your left-wing lane, just stay a little bit like the left, and don't go to the right.
I mean, he has
right when it comes to transphobia, queerphobia.
He's the best. He keep these things. Keep your personal. Traditionally, we on the left keep our personal views about sexuality, religion, and so on to ourselves, because this is not. We're trying to unify the workers and show get them to fight against the real enemies. The elite in society who are ripping them off, not to get into all these things that can divide people. So, and the sad thing is that he has he's the best public speaker in Britain on the stage. He's a brilliant orator.
I mean, to quote, ironically, to quote Nigel Farage, to quote Nigel Farage, he is one of the greatest orators of this country, and he is a towering figure on the left of British politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome George Galloway. So, yeah. Right.
But the other, perhaps indicative of this, we have to question whether George Galloway is, his attitude towards internal democracy. Because, how could he be speaking, just giving his own personal views as if they're the, he's supposed to be there representing the Workers' Party. So he should be putting forward their manifesto, not his own personal point of view. And I worry that within that need to assert their democratic rights with that party to ensure that George Galloway doesn't just go off and say whatever he feels like, but he puts forward the party's position. And unless he does that, then I don't see that's going to go anywhere, the party. If they, on the other hand, I mean, I think from the impression I get is that they have a lot of good left-wingers in that party, working class left-wingers and trade unionists. If they can assert the democratic rights of the party and get Galloway in line, then that party still got some way to go. But if they don't, then I don't think there's any future for it,
We still have some. We still have some time. So
okay.
So let's talk briefly about. Let's talk. Well, actually, we'll do this. Scotland deserves its own program, and I'm going to work to make sure that we can get you and another person who follows Scottish politics from a critical left perspective to talk about Scotland. But let's talk very briefly about Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland. Okay. So Scotland first. Did the SNP lose because people just got fatigued with the SNP being in power for so long, and given the hostility that much of the Scottish corporate dailies and the dominant dominant media in Scotland is still BBC Scotland, which is very pro-unionist, and Scotland being part of the United Kingdom. And sometimes, no matter how good your policies may be, no matter how much good you've done for the country, if it's not being reported in the media, people are going to think that you've not done anything and ergo vote against you. And that's I know both Hugo Chavez and Maduro and others like Lula have and Evo Morales have had to face challenges like that from a very hostile far right media. Is that what happened with the SNP, and also the fact that? Yeah, so I'm curious your response.
Well, I mean, to be fair to the capitalist media, they're divided in Scotland. So some important parts of the media support the SNP and have done so. So I don't know if that's the explanation. I think the problem you've got is that all local governments, and in that I include the Scottish Assembly and the Scottish executive, they all had the same problem in that the central government of Britain kept cutting back the money that was available to them. And okay, the Scottish Parliament had some devolved powers, which did allow them to do some good things, like not charge tuition fees to students and do some other more favorable positions on health and so on, but within very limited framework. So they didn't have the money to implement the kind of program they wanted for Scotland. And so all the local governments throughout the country have all suffered because of that and lost popularity. So because they end up doing, to one degree or another, the dirty work of the central government, which, remember, from 2010 onwards was just cutting and cutting and cutting. And so the other problem is that people's falling living standards in Britain as a whole, which some of which is nothing to do with Scottish government, people tend to blame whoever's closest to them in power for these things. So so there's that important factor as well. And last but not least, there was also this internal problems within the Scottish Nationalist Party of corruption, and one leader resigns, then another leader had to resign, and the strategies they were following were not very radical. There was a tendency to move a bit more towards the neoliberal policies. All of these things meant that they weren't able to maintain their level of support. So these are the natural things that will tend to happen unless you adopt a radical program and step out from this kind of centrist corporate agenda. Then this is what's going to happen to you. And we're seeing this, aren't we, all over Europe, in America, and everywhere else. The people are fed up with the center politics, because it's making their life worse. And they're looking for radical alternatives, and they try one, then they try another. And this is what happened in Scotland to some extent, that they thought, well, they also wanted to get the Tories out. Remember, there was that whole thing, that desperation to get the Tories out in Britain, in London, meant that a lot of Scots felt the same way. And they thought, well, let's vote for Labour to get the Conservatives out, and then we can go back to our politics within Scotland. But having said that, looking ahead, and this is where I think we need to talk about a few things. What's the perspectives for this new Labour government? This is an important question. Now, they've committed themselves to basically not spend hardly any money, not to tax the rich, and somehow or other they think that they can achieve growth, which is their mantra. They want to increase growth in Britain, and from that will then, through extra treasury receipts from taxation and so on, that will give them some money in the future to spend on improving public services and so on. But the way that they're going to do that, because they're not willing to raise taxes and they're not willing to take the hard decisions on behalf of working people, they're going for private investment. So they're setting up these investment vehicles where they hope to attract private investment from around the world to invest in Britain. But we've seen this strategy tried before, and it's not going to work because
under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown,
and it's not going to work because under Tony Blair and Brown, it was okay because there was a world economic boom taking place. The big neoliberal boom of the late mid 80s to the 2008 crisis. So they had 20 years of a boom that they could gain income from and use that to spend on the NHS and some other things. They introduced improved child benefit and other things like that. But they're not willing to. For example, we've got an issue now in the Parliament where the Conservatives brought in a two-child benefit cap, so that if a family had more than 2 children, then they lost their child benefit, and that's causing huge amount of child poverty, with a lot of children going to bed hungry and not, their parents not having enough to buy their clothes, and all these kind of dreadful things are happening. And it's only £2.5 billion we're talking about here, which is peanuts. The Labour is willing to spend billions and billions on defence and you name it, but they're not willing to rescind this cap. And they say they don't have the money for it. So this is the kind of problem that they're going to have. Now, I think that you would think Labour was starting in a fantastically strong position, given that they've got this massive majority in the Parliament. But the economy is in a terrible shape. The growth rate is less than 1%. It could be that if there's recession that's coming in America, it looks like it's coming in America, usually spreads to Britain. That could be even worse. So they won't have the big income that the last Labour government had, and they're even more to the right and less willing to be radical. So we're likely to see a Labour government. In fact, it's been predicted by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is okay. It's a neoliberal institution, but nevertheless, it does try to calculate what the spending plans of the different parties are, and they predicted that both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party's election manifestos will really mean big cuts in public spending are coming, because they won't have the money to do what they promised, the little they did promise. Yeah. And so we're probably going to see a Labour government coming into conflict with working people, with the trade unions and so on, and becoming already unpopular in terms of his personality rating and the fact that people regard him as untrustworthy. I can see a situation within a year or 18 months, maybe even less, Labour running into the buffers and having all kinds of protests and votes in the Commons, splits in the Labour Party MPs and among the opposition parties. And I could see that situation where Labour will start to become very unpopular. And when we have by-elections where, when a member of the Parliament dies or decides to retire or leave the country or whatever they do, and then they have an election in a local area, I could see Labour losing those elections. And the question is then, where is the discontent with Labour that's going to come where's it going to go? Is it going to go to the Reform Party, which has got all the media mouthpieces, with its 5 members of parliament, or is it going to go to the left outside of Labour with its 5 members of parliament? And that's where the left has to get its act together and learn some lessons. Now, listening to discussion among the left in Britain outside of Labour, that does seem to be a lesson that most people have realised, that we can't have a divided left. Although, unfortunately, some of the representatives of the Workers' Party are still kind of trying to put themselves as the alternative, exclusively in a way. But I think that the reality is that most of the people on the left outside of Labour have learned from this election that we have to unite. And I think what's crucial is, one, they do that we end this kind of division on the left, which if we're divided on the left, we're never, I mean, that was the lesson of the French election. The fact that all the forces on the left joined together made a huge difference in the first round. I'm not talking about where they linked up with Macron. I think there's a lot of arguments about that to be had. But anyway, but they certainly came out on top because of their popular front they created. And I think the second lesson is that they need to come forward with a name for their United Front and a manifesto that is very radical and popular and forward-looking. Because the trouble is that the left in the past, well, left up until now, has tended to be seen as very backward-looking. That they want to go back to the good old days of the 1970s or 60s, and they don't seem to be coming forward with programs. So for example, they're talking about renationalizing things. You know what I mean? What we should be doing is we should be looking forward.
Which if you do that for public transportation, the railways, and you invest in light rail, that will go down well. But this whole idea of reopening coal mines and stuff.
Well, I don't mean it. No, I don't mean it. I don't know if that's what they're intending to do. I don't think anybody on the left is thinking about that. But what I mean is that yes, we want to take back these older industries into like transport and electricity, gas, the
water,
post office, and so on. These utilities back into public ownership. But I think we should be looking to creating state-owned enterprises. We should learn from China. We should look to set up state-owned enterprises in every sector of the economy, and with a totally different administration. Instead of the old top-down bureaucratic management of the past of the nationalized industries, we need to bring the workers in those industries and the customers of those industries, and where relevant other sectors, bring them into as key partners in the running of those industries, so that they're no longer these kind of slow-moving, inefficient, and bureaucratic entities, but actually reflect what the customers want, and the creativity of the workers in those industries, and so on. And then we can create a model which is much more successful and can outcompete the capitalists. I think that these are the kind of ideas that we need to think about if we want to, look forward and present something that's for the 21st century rather than the 20th century.
We also need to stop supporting the Labour Party and seeing them as the lesser evil when they are the more effective evil.
Well, on that question, no, that's an important question you're raising there, because I think that we have to have a non-sectarian approach, in the sense of that in the Labour Party that's been elected to the Parliament, one of the strange results is that the number of socialists who have been elected to Parliament under the Labour ticket is actually increased. There were one or two casualties of the purge among the Parliamentary Labour Party, but actually they backed the Labour leadership because of a lot of trouble within the election campaign itself. They backtracked on some of those candidates and they let them stand again.
Like Diane Abbott.
But like Diane Abbott and so on, and Andy McDonald in the Northwest and so on. And but funnily enough, there's been a whole number of left-wing, effectively pro-Corbynite MPs elected, who they were elected in conservative areas that nobody thought that it could be won. And so last year, when the right wing were putting all their people into all the safe Labour seats and marginal Labour seats, they didn't bother to stand for these Conservative seats because they thought they'd never be able to win. And so the election, one of the ironies of this landslide is that a number of Labour MPs have been elected who are actually on the left. So the Socialist Campaign Group in the Parliament, which has been very quiet under Starmer's leadership, because he had a very dictatorial attitude, and he threatened them that they would be thrown out of the Labour Party if they tried to make any noise. So that's why you haven't seen any protests from them much about cars and other issues. But I think that now one of the effects of having a massive majority is that pressure will be reduced. And I think that we'll see the left in Parliament and inside the Labour Party increasingly vociferous and effective in their opposition. So my attitude to this is, and we don't know how all this is going to pan out. It's possible, there's two possible routes that could happen. One, that Starmer could become discredited very quickly as a leader. And therefore, and the result could be that I don't know when this would happen.
Actually, one second.
Sure.
Hey, Fiona, can I call you back in just a second? I'm almost done with this interview. Okay, see you soon. Okay. Sorry about that.
Is that the same Fiona? Is that the same Fiona you were talking about?
Yes. Fiona Sim.
No.
People should check out my interview with them. All about China.
Okay.
All about China.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, so there's a possibility that at some point he will no longer be. He will stand down from Labour. And in that situation, then maybe a more left of centre, or even a little bit more radical. It won't be a Corbyn figure, obviously, but it could be some kind of Andy Burnham type figure will be elected as leader of the party with a more relaxed regime inside the party, in which case the left could start to revive. That's one possibility. Or it could be that things will get so bad in the Parliament that a split will develop within Labour, a very serious split where the unions feel no longer able to support what Starmer is doing in government and imposing these reactionary measures against working people. And then a new party, building on the success of this 5 independents, a new party could start to form with mass support among the unions and so on. Now, if that does happen, then you're talking about a large number of left Labour MPs maybe joining such a party. So, we don't know how all this is going to pan out, because we're really in unusual times, unprecedented times historically. And so therefore, I think we shouldn't adopt a sectarian attitude. We should always focus on what program, what we want to do, what we want to achieve for working people. And then the forces that will support that come behind that. That's the way. So we don't know where the chips will fall, because even some of the middle of the road Labour MPs who've been elected, historically, sometimes they go to the left in these situations. You just don't know what's going to happen. So I think that's the best approach.
And here's hoping that eco-socialists of the Greens mobilize. Here's hoping socially liberal and the left faction of the Liberal Democrats mobilize. And I have some hope in organizations like Transform UK, but still room for improvement, and still.
But I think all these 4, there's a whole number of these groups, aren't they? Like Transform, the Workers' Party, the Socialist Party,
Socialist Equality Party,
Socialist Equality Party. There's a whole number of these groups, and if we're going to be successful as a mass left force, as many of these groups as we can need to come and join together and work together and find ways to do that. They may not agree with the whole program of the party, but they've got to be willing to see that. What was it? The old slogan, united we stand, divided we fall. They've got to remember that old slogan and bring it back into reality,
And folks, always go to the left. Don't go to the right, which is blue Labour territory and
right.
Well, On this is we were and I'll just say one last thing. The SNP I'll just say one last thing. For Scottish independence, it has to broaden its horizons. It can't just be SNP, Alba, and Scottish Greens. You have to have Scottish Tories, Scottish Liberal Democrats, and Scottish Labour believing in independence and divorcing themselves from their brothers or their masters back in Britain. And Northern Ireland was quite interesting to see that their idea of a protest vote was Sinn Féin. So very interesting. One of Ian Paisley's sons lost his election, and that's because of changing demographics, EU left reform,
Yes, yeah,
and also folks just tired of the sectarianism of the UDP and deciding let's give Sinn Féin a chance. So we are joined, but yeah, so it'll be very interesting, and we'll have to have you back on within a year's time to assess how Britain is faring under Keir Starmer. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Pat Byrne, our all things England edition. Pat, thank you so much for joining me, especially on this, especially because I believe it's late afternoon for you now in Brazil. And the next time,
no problem.
The next time we have you on, I promise it'll be all about China, and we're going to talk about BRICS, particularly Brazil and so forth.
Good.
So.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pat.
These are subjects I've been specializing on in the last couple of years, so I'd be welcome that. That would be very good.
And Pat has a book about China coming out, and we're going to make sure to plug that when he comes back in. Right. So, Pat, thank you so much, and power to the people, death to capitalism, I say.
Yeah, same to you. Same here, Youri. Bye-bye.